Welcome, everyone, to today's talk on Smashing the Liquor Machine, a global history of prohibition. Before we get started, I have a few brief announcements. The first thing is that this talk is being recorded, although only Mark and I can be seen or heard on the recording. So your privacy is being respected. After today's talk, the recording can be heard as both a video and audio recording, which can be accessed on the Burkle Center website, as well as on YouTube and on Apple Podcasts. So please feel free to share these recordings with your friends or colleagues if they can't be here. Also, please feel free to submit any questions you'd like to ask of the speaker during the talk using the Q&A portal, which should be located at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest for today's talk, which is Mark Schrod. Mark works at Villanova University. He's a professor of political science, as well as director of Russian area studies at Villanova University. He has authored 3 books for Oxford University Press. The one before today's book is a book called Vodka Politics: Alcohol, Autocracy, and the Secret History of the Russian State. So as you can tell by that title, as well as the book that he's going to be talking about today, he's pretty much cornered the market on the study of alcohol and political science. Today's book also was recently announced as the winner of the Best Book in Historical International Relations by the International Studies Association. I expect it will also be racking up some Best Book Awards from the American Political Science Association as well in a couple of months, because I can tell you it's a really compelling, interesting, colorful read. It was my beach book for this summer, although it's quite thick and it took quite a while to read. I'll really strongly encourage everyone here to read it. It was a wonderful book. And now I'm going to go ahead and throw the microphone over to our guest author, Mark, who will go ahead and give us all an introduction to his project.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Leslie and the Burkle Center. I'm very much looking forward to this presentation, and good to see some familiar faces and what have you. And I should note that just in passing, one of our colleagues here at Villanova, just right across the hallway there, our colleague Ryan Weldzius is a UCLA alum, and he was singing your praises and was telling me in great detail that one of the best things about his time at UCLA, in addition to the copious sunshine, were these Burkle Center events. And so I'm hoping to live up to that to that billing, I suppose, in some ways. And so welcome. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the new book, Smashing the Liquor Machine. It is ridiculously big. My apologies. I have to go up. I remember when the book first came, the author's copies came in the mail. My wife and I just opened them and we were just laughing hysterically. Why would anybody write such a big book over such a avowedly dry topic? So the story of the book, I want to give you a little bit of an overview. Obviously, we're not going to get into intricate details. A lot of that is in the book, so we can maybe pick up with some of that on the Q&A in a little bit. But I want to give you a little bit of overview of the project, kind of where the ideas come from, how the approach comes into being, and give kind of a glimpse of it. And so if we want to delve into greater details into sort of these global elements of the history of Prohibition, we can certainly do that. So I'm going to try to do the share screen feature here, and hopefully this works. Let's see. We'll go there, hit share, and okay, we're sharing now, I hope. And so we'll hit play. So this is the the book here, and so just in terms of the the approach and how we kind of went with it. I've for a long time I've been fascinated in a couple of different things. One is Russian history and Soviet history. Again, as Leslie was saying, my previous book was on vodka politics, which is kind of a drunk history of Russia, but looks at the role that alcohol plays in throughout Russian history. And the thesis of that book is that alcoholism that we oftentimes associate with Russia isn't some sort of just cultural factor. It's actually the result of centuries of political and economic decision making that's at the heart of autocratic statecraft. And so that was kind of the one of the foci, I suppose, of this. I've always had that interest in Russia, things Soviet, but in terms of American history, also I've been fascinated with temperance, and I think the thing that unites those two is for much of our sort of Cold War history, the Soviets and the Russians, I guess even contemporary history, are the bad guys, right? Those are the villains. And so if America in American history, if we have villains, it always seems to revolve around the temperance movement, because they get portrayed as these people like Carrie Nation, who you see here on the slide, these kind of hatchet wielding Bible thumpers, these evangelical zealots who are there to take away your freedom to drink. And so they get posed as these again, sort of the villains of American history. And so I think that kind of interest in who we vilify and why has kind of been at the center of a lot of my research going way back. And so if you go into, and again, there's not a whole lot of political scientists who do much with regards to temperance and prohibitionism. I think I might be alone out there in the field, as Leslie was saying. But if you go into sort of the history literature and you want to explain why we had prohibition or prohibitionism in the United States, you usually end up with the works of Joseph Gusfield, who said that it was a symbolic crusade, that it was a backlash of rural nativist reactionary evangelical zealots against sort of this new wave of modernization and immigration. So it was the last gasp of the old order. And so I remember actually quite vividly, 2016, election night 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, and you had CNN contributor Van Jones got up on TV, and he declared that what we were seeing was what he called a white lash. It was this reactionary movement is the last gasp of rural Protestant evangelical zealots against sort of the modernization of the United States and this multiculturalism. And I was like, that's a great line, that's a great term, but that's the exact same way that we've conceptualized what prohibitionism is in the United States. So it's been one of those things that people place temperance and prohibitionism as kind of this red thread of intolerance throughout American history that goes back, they say, to the Puritans, goes right through, temperance, and straight into sort of modern, movements to overturn Roe v. Wade, and sort of the anti-abortion rights activism. So that's kind of how it's portrayed, right? And they suggest that this is a particularly uniquely American phenomenon. And I was like, okay. And this is something I kind of began with my first book, which was based on my dissertation, came out. This is The Political Power of Bad Ideas. And I said, okay, if I'm not even going to question that, I'm going to buy that assumption that this is what prohibition was all about in the United States. But if we take a look at the globe, back around the era of World War I said, okay, if that cultural politics explanation is really what's going on, I say, well, that may explain why we have prohibition in the United States, but it doesn't explain why you had prohibition also in all of these other countries around the globe, including Imperial Russia, including Turkey, secular Turkey. You've got Norway, Finland, Iceland, all these areas. Not a whole lot of Midwestern Bible thumping evangelical Protestants in all these areas. Furthermore, it doesn't explain why, in addition to the areas in red, you have at the exact same time in all these areas in orange, a movement for greater restrictions on the alcohol trade. that oftentimes came up just short of prohibition. And it certainly doesn't explain why, in all the countries in red and orange and in yellow, you have this transnational advocacy network of like-minded individuals focused on temperance that actually goes back to the very origins of transnational activism. And so that was kind of the focus of my first book, which looked at, sort of did a comparative analysis of the United States and Imperial Russia, and also sort of corporatist Sweden to see how these different elements were kind of shaking out. And so, so it also made me scrutinize that, when you start to look even sort of rudimentary at the global history of prohibitionism, you find that it wasn't uniquely American. There were actually 12 other countries or empires that were that had instituted some degree of prohibitionism. And the temperance movement itself, rather than being some footnote to history, was actually sort of the most robust, longest lived, and most successful global transnational advocacy network in history at that point in time. And so, but also it started to raise all sorts of really uncomfortable questions about how we understand what prohibitionism actually was. And so if you have this idea that it was just culture clash, it was evangelical Protestants, well, how does that get translated into policy? And certainly, how does that get translated, these cultural elements into, into the 18th Amendment in particular? The causal mechanisms are never clearly defined in that particular way. Second, it was this weird question of, if we conceptualize prohibitionism as this right-wing reactionary movement, how could you have organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union that was simultaneously reactionary, quote unquote, in promoting prohibitionism, and very progressive at the same time, pushing for women's rights, suffragist movement, and also made common cause with abolitionists, labor. And so that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And furthermore, if you say that, if what describes or, what explains prohibitionism was all evangelical Protestantism, well, then why was there no sort of great awakening at that point in time? Actually, if you look at the time, or, in the sort of the progressive era, I guess when it comes to attendance in churches, we're all very much down. And so it wasn't like there was some huge religious fervor had gripped the nation, just the exact opposite as it was, right? And furthermore, if we see prohibitionism as a reactionary movement, how is it that we have this crowning achievement of this reactionary prohibitionism, the passing of the 18th Amendment? It got ratified in 1919, smack dab in the middle of the progressive era. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? And then, of course, if you spend some time sort of just understanding, the conventional wisdom that we have with prohibitionism, often a lot of it gets put onto women. They get vilified, they get blamed for putting over prohibition while the men were out fighting in World War I, which is another batch of craziness, because we all know chronologically, the 18th Amendment, which institutes prohibition, came before the 19th Amendment, which is when women got the right to vote. So if you look at the record, Jeanette Rankin was the only woman who actually voted for prohibition. All the rest of them were dudes, right? All of them were guys. And so so we start to get, prohibition gets intertwined with all these different sort of myths of American history, and whatnot. But I think the key, because I want to be cognizant of time here, the key to really understanding prohibition and prohibitionism is to recognize that prohibitionism wasn't an attempt to ban alcohol. It wasn't about the stuff in the bottle. And if you go back and read the original documents, you find that the phrase that always comes up time and time again isn't alcohol prohibition. They say they're prohibiting the liquor traffic. And that word traffic is incredibly important, right? Because trafficking in something is different from the thing being trafficked, right? So conflating those two is a big problem. So, for example, you can be very much against human trafficking, which is the process of making money in trafficking human beings, right? And not be against the human beings themselves. You're not against the thing that's being trafficked. You're against sort of the predatory economy of making money by selling and trafficking in this scarce commodity. And so so that I think is really key, that the focus on the liquor traffic rather than liquor itself, because even the 18th Amendment didn't prohibit the actual consumption of alcohol. It prohibited the liquor traffic. It prohibited the buying and selling of alcohol in those ways. And so I think those are some key elements just to, that's kind of the thumbnail sketch of this. But I did want to give you a brief overview of the book itself. And it starts off with the, with the introductory chapter and whatnot. So the idea was this. I said, okay, this was my proposal for the book. It's like, all right, well, we have a pretty good idea about what caused prohibition in the United States. It doesn't entirely make sense, but my interest was not so much in the United States, but to see what prohibitionism was like in the rest of the world. And so I proposed like maybe a nice little 8-chapter book, nice little summary at the end, little conclusion, to see what insights we might have for American history and American prohibitionism. And so the chapters kind of go unit by, the unit of analysis ultimately in this case is an empire, right? So I look at the different empires, and I start in if we go back and look at the world as it was on the eve of World War I. The second chapter takes us to the Russian Empire. And so let's see, here it is right there. This is kind of the focus again of my previous book on vodka politics. And what you find is that in the Russian Empire in particular, that, you had a stringent prohibitionism, and it wasn't a movement of conservative evangelical Protestants, but some of the most, formidable names are people that you would recognize from a cursory look into, late Tsarist politics. People like Leo Tolstoy was probably the country's foremost prohibitionist, because he recognized that at that point in time, the liquor traffic, the vodka traffic, was how the Russian Empire of Nicholas II, 1/3 of all the revenues of the mighty Russian Empire came from selling alcohol to their own peasantry, which is a huge amount, right? And so Lenin also recognized this. He was a prohibitionist as well. And the argument was that, that if you want to bring down this autocratic system and liberate the peasantry, liberate the people, you have to wean them from the thing that's making them addicted to the alcohol. And it's not just the vodka per se, it's this entire system that profits from selling alcohol to its own people and making them drunk and disoriented and everything that kind of comes with that. And so chapter 2 looks at prohibitionism and a sort of anti-authoritarian sort of communism, and looks at it through the guise of some of these important leaders like Leo Tolstoy, like Lenin, and so on. So chapter 2 kind of focuses on that. Chapter 3 takes us next door, and instead of looking at sort of anti-authoritarian communism, looks at democratic socialism in some of these vignettes. And I do try to, rather than being necessarily about big structures, I try to imbibe this in stories about significant historical figures, right? So people like, the first social democratic leader of Sweden, Hjalmar Branting, Nobel Peace Prize winner. He was a member of the temperance organization, as were most social democrats at that point in time, for the same reason, that you wanted to have the uplift of the labor movement. That meant, fighting against this entrenched system that was profiting off of getting the people drunk and disoriented. And so that chapter looks at Sweden in particular, and social democracy in Sweden, and sort of the Communist International as well, but also Belgium with Emile van der Velde, who was the head of the Socialist International, and probably the most outspoken prohibitionist in Belgium at that point in time. But he was also avowedly outspoken about essentially being anti-colonial, so he was the one, probably more than anyone, who was standing up against King Leopold's, plans for the Belgian Congo and the exploitation, because he saw the same sort of exploitation that was going on in Belgium, where you had, these Belgians going in and getting natives addicted to alcohol so that you could exploit them and exploit their labor and exploit their lands and everything they have to offer. He saw the exact same thing that was happening in Belgium proper with the labor movement. And so it was very interesting to see these sorts of commonalities, and we'll get to sort of the colonial, anti-colonial aspects to it a little bit later as well. So that was, sort of the third chapter looked at socialism, moved from communism to socialism. Chapter 4 looked at temperance and prohibition in sort of the continental empires, in the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and was associated in this particular case with not necessarily with socialism, but with political liberalism. And so this idea that we need to liberate people, we need to make sure that we have people who are educated and not befuddled, not clouded by drink, and who can be contributing members of a democratic society. And so you have people like Tomas Masaryk, sort of the founding father of modern Czechoslovakia, was sort of the foremost prohibitionist in his way as well. And so you have that same sort of dynamic when it comes to liberalism in the German Empire and also the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well. So again, trying to make sure that we have a good geographic representation of all these different empires, especially through Europe. But obviously the big one is the British Empire. And so we've got a number of chapters that are just on the British Empire. Chapter 5 looks at, for lack of a better term, the white British Empire. And so looks at relations not only within Britain itself, but with regards to Ireland. And so, we have a lot of stereotypes about Irish drinking, but one thing that might surprise you is that 150 years ago, Ireland probably had more temperance members than any other country on earth. So you had Father Theobald Matthew and his temperance campaign there, which gets co-opted by fellows like Daniel O'Connell into this movement against British colonization. The idea was that we need to have Ireland, as they said, Ireland sober, Ireland free, so that we can fight against the colonial oppression of the British, because ultimately it was the English in particular, who were profiting from the drunken misery of the Irish there. And so chapter 3 looks at those dynamics not only in Ireland, but also in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, these same types of dynamics time and time again that have very, very deep roots. Chapter 6 then takes us to, I guess, British South Africa, and has a very, very interesting corollary to it, that you have, sort of the British South Africa Company, and headed up by Cecil Rhodes, or the imperialist, as it were, fighting against local indigenous African leaders in what is today Botswana, what was then known as Bechuanaland. But fellows like King Kama III were adamant that, if there was anything that was worth fighting for against British colonialism, it was two things. One was, sort of ownership of the land, but second was to keep the white man's liquor out of their territories. Because again, you have sort of the introduction of distilled alcohol, for the most part, is what we're looking at, not fermented beers, not wines, but whiskeys, gins, rums, those types of very highly potent and highly profitable concoctions are the things that you had native leaders that were pushing against, because they had seen the ruin that it came with introducing these new industrial distillates into a population that are highly, these are highly addictive, highly potent, and they had no previous history with, with this alcohol in these particular types of cases. And so that was a very interesting, it really kind of drives home the anti-colonial nature of this, when the people who were selling the liquor traffickers, tended to be white British men, and the people who were on the temperance and prohibition side were the Black African populations and their leaders, like King Kama. So we see that in Botswana. Chapter 7 essentially moves from South Africa and actually follows Mahatma Gandhi in particular as a prohibitionist. Sort of cuts his teeth in British South Africa and then goes back home to India. But his entire movement, sort of the non-cooperation movement against the British, was premised on temperance and prohibitionism. The idea being that not that alcohol itself is bad, but it's alcohol and the Abkari revenue that was drawn from it is going to profit and is going to benefit the British and their military domination over India in particular. And so So that was fascinating to see sort of the same sort of dynamics that you have in India are pretty much the same as you had with the opium wars in China as well, that you had opium in China and alcohol in India became the instrument of colonization just as much as you have with bayonets and bullets in many cases. And then finally, I guess for our purposes, Chapter 8 looks at the Ottoman Empire, in particular, very interesting tapestry of temperance forces and alcohol in the former Ottoman areas. But more importantly, you have, with sort of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, and sort of the rise of secular Turkey, you have Mustafa Kemal Ataturk there, who is in reality probably the drunkest leader in world history. He died very early from liver cirrhosis because he was drinking, bottles of raki every single night. So he wasn't exactly, a card-carrying temperance member, but he was actually instrumental in the institution of prohibition in Anatolia, in Turkey at that point in time. Again, not based upon any personal resentment against alcohol, but the idea was that this is something that is, the benefits from the sales of alcohol are going to benefit the Greeks and the British in particular. And so he says, as a measure, we need to, if we're going to have a system like this, we should have it so that it benefits our people rather than those imperial colonial oppressors. Now, I know that I'm almost out of time here, but that's where the book was supposed to end. The book, as it turns out, is quite a bit longer than this. But we had a brown bag discussion here at Villanova and with one of my colleagues, and I kind of presented the story as it was so far. And one of my colleagues across the hallway here, Jennifer Dixon, if you know her, just a wonderful scholar. She says, "Okay, great. But if we were to buy this hypothesis that you were putting out here, that temperance was not about Bible-thumping evangelicals, but was this anti-colonial system to push back against sort of predatory capitalism," she says, "Where are the Native Americans? Where are the Native Americans in your account?" And I was like, "You got me. They're not there." But that's the exact moment that this book went from being 8 or 9 chapters to being 18 chapters. Because one of the things that happens, and I'll, I guess, come off of the screen sharing here. One of the things that happens when you take this kind of perspective and recognize that it's not about the alcohol that's in the bottle, but against this predatory economy, you find that in the American history, America's first prohibitionists were its first peoples, were Native Americans. From the very arrival of European colonists, you had Native American leaders pushing back against sort of this deprivation. And in fact, the first federal prohibition wasn't the 18th Amendment. It actually came in 1802 by Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers. You had Native American leaders, including the leader of the Miami Confederacy of Ohio, Chief Little Turtle, pleads with essentially, it goes all the way to Washington, D.C., makes common cause with a bunch of Quakers along the way, and pleads the United States government to institute a prohibition against trafficking in what they called the white man's wicked water with Native American populations. And Jefferson thought that was a good idea. All of our elected representatives thought it was a good idea, in order to sort of protect the Native peoples against the domination and subordination that comes with, essentially enslaving an entire population to drink. And so you see that again from Native American populations to African American populations. You find that there's essentially, when you go back to the 1840s and 1850s, temperance was essentially synonymous with abolitionism. So, the top abolitionists of the day, your William Lloyd Garrisons, your Abraham Lincolns, your Frederick Douglasses, were all temperance-minded prohibitionists to a man, right? But the idea was that you wanted to make sure that when it came to the liberation of the African-American population, that the chains of slavery don't just slip from the hands of the white slave keeper to the white tavern owner. Right. And so it was the same sort of thing that, is a pushback against this system of subjugation, domination, and subordination. And so you have, just to wrap things up here, You have guys like Frederick Douglass, whose famous line was that all great reforms go together. And he meant three reforms. He meant abolitionism, abolition of the slave trade, suffragism, women's rights, and temperance. Those were his big three. And the thing that unites all of this, and the thing that unites the entire book, is that we have to reposition this not as a conservative backlash against modernization and immigration, but this was a fundamentally progressive movement that was part of this global shift in sort of norms of human rights in particular, that said, hey, it's not okay for one group of people to take advantage and essentially subordinate another group of people through addiction for profit. And so that, that lines up perfectly with abolitionism, that lines up perfectly with suffragism, and is part of this kind of global movement of sort of labor rights and progressivism that has its echoes throughout this book and throughout the temperance movement as well. So looking at the clock, I think I've run over a little bit, but hopefully we can pick up with some of these questions as we continue on.
Okay, thanks so much, Mark. I do have to apologize to the audience. It's a huge project. And I did tell Mark, focus on the international, because we're an international relations center. I should say, I mean, the second half of the book is really about challenging it presents a completely alternative view of American history. I think that is a huge innovation in what the book is doing. So if you are an American history buff, that second half of the book is really powerful. And I think, Mark, you've done a tremendous service to American historians in doing that. But one thing I wanted to talk about just in our Q&A, and I should say, if you are interested in submitting a question to the Q&A, please go ahead and click that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and go ahead and type in your question, and I'll be bringing those in. But I wanted to get us started with a few questions of my own. This book came to my attention initially through an op-ed that Mark had written in the Washington Post. It got published in January. And it did a really amazing job about talking about how our conceptions of human rights or freedoms and rights have changed so much over time, an issue that you just alluded to, right? And that I thought it did a really nice job of talking about how in the time period that you're talking about of prohibitionism, there was much more emphasis on sort of social rights, this notion of groups as opposed to individuals. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the time period you're talking about, there was a lot more emphasis on the social impact of liquor, as opposed to our more modern conceptions, which tend to think about sort of individual liberties and consumer choices, and how our notions of rights can change over time.
Yeah, and I think that was what drove me initially into this question.
Yeah.
Was because looking back, I grew up like any kid in the United States. You go through civics class or social studies, and I kind of looked at the the Constitution as kind of like the received wisdom of the United States. Mm-hmm. Right. So, that we have, this Bill of Rights, and it looks pretty good, but it needed some updating. So, no slavery. That makes sense. Equal rights. Excellent. That's a good thing, right? Women should have the right to vote. Great. But then you get this 18th Amendment. You're like, but no alcohol traffic, right? And like, okay, what was that about, right? Yeah. And so I think for a long time that was the thing that drove this whole investigation, was trying to figure out what was that about. I can't figure out, wrap our minds around that. It certainly couldn't have been that everybody went crazy, and that you had enough people in the United States to because our self-image is of freedom-loving, liberty-loving individuals, right? That's who we are, right? And so this idea that these temperance people, including some formative Americans, I guess very important ones, were somehow against freedom and against liberty, the individual right to drink, seemed really crazy. And ultimately I found that, it wasn't so much based upon, that the temperance and prohibition movements, were wrong necessarily, but we're wrong. We're having a hard time of understanding what was motivating them back in the day, right? And so we come up with all these concoctions, we come up with these conspiracy theories, we come up with these arguments that it was, it was all women's faults, even though women couldn't vote, right? While the boys were off fighting in World War I. Well, no, it's not like they missed a vote. There was no vote, right? And so, and actually the Congress that got us to the 18th Amendment, was voted in 1916, well before any sort of military intervention in World War I by the United States, right? So it's like all these different things, none of it makes sense in particular, and so the thing that's kind of spurred the op-ed piece was focusing in on how our conceptions change over time, because we naturally, I mean, we're all sort of driven by ego, right? We think that we're right. We look out our windows and we assume that, that's these basic concepts that we've always had forever look the same now as they ever always had, so basic notions of liberty and freedom. We don't need like a primer on that. We have an understanding of what freedom means, even if you don't have like a textbook definition. And so the question was, and I guess, you're right in kind of pointing this out, that if you go back to, what was motivating the temperance movement, they were interested more so in these kind of sort of collective freedoms, right? The freedom of a, subordinated population, whether that's, freedom of self-determination of Native American peoples, of African-American peoples during Jim Crow era in particular, of women, disenfranchised women, right? And so this idea that we have that particular elements to it, I think is particularly key. And I think the other thing that kind of happens is, you've got temperance, you got the Prohibition era, after World War I. It kind of slowly dies out through the 1920s. And of course you get repeal by 1933. And by that time, nobody really wants to talk about it, right? I mean, everybody's just kind of licking their wounds, and it's not like anybody's gearing up for another fight about prohibitionism. And a lot of the people who were fighting for it, those old-timey prohibitionists, a lot of them have died or are in retirements, or very, very old, right? And so there's nobody there to kind of defend what they were thinking, and so it became very easy for sort of this new round of scholars to come in and kind of just completely lambast, and kind of give their own interpretation of what they thought was motivating these temperance folks. And so that's where you start to get this I guess more of a notion that these are people who hate our freedoms and want to take away our freedom to drink. But the other thing that comes out of that era is sort of the rise of that sort of economic neoliberalism. And so the suggestion that any infringement upon my individual economic freedoms to buy and sell, is necessarily also an infringement upon my political liberties. And that's a fundamentally new understanding, right? That's something that, before World War I, there was a firewall between political liberties and economic liberties. And you can go back and read the Supreme Court findings on questions of temperance and prohibitionism, and they're all universal in this way, that nobody has you can talk about your freedom to drink, but also there's a suggestion that you don't have the freedom to sell alcohol. You don't have the freedom to sell a highly toxic poison any more than you have a right to sell, spoiled meats, for instance, or adulterated foods. These are not things that are necessarily part of your freedom. So in many cases, that blurring the division between economic liberties and political liberties leaves us in something of a distorted view of history, right? So our own conceptions of what is freedom and what is not freedom is fundamentally different from people, in the 1920s, 19-teens, and even before then.
Well, so we do have some questions in the Q&A about the repeal of prohibition. So maybe we'll set that aside for the moment, knowing that we're probably going to come back to that, because I think that's a really key issue. So we'll set that aside for a moment, because we are going to come back to that, I think. So another thing that I was really struck by, and you did allude to this in your presentation, is this distinction between fermentation and distilled liquor, which, I'm not a huge drinker, so I didn't really know the difference until I read the book, but it turns out it's really important. Just for the audience, the sort of metaphor that I had in my mind is I kept having this image in my brain of, journalist accounts that I had read of like the Germans attacking Herrero's soldiers, right? Where they have these accounts of like the Herrero soldiers are standing with these spears in their hands, and the Germans are attacking them with airplanes and machine guns, right? And you're kind of like, okay, like they both have weapons, right? But one's a spear and one's a machine gun. And that's kind of like the metaphor that I kind of got from your description of like the difference between fermented alcohol and like distilled alcohol, right? And so the impression I sort of get is that like colonialism was bringing in, like, yes, these societies already had alcohol, but like it's a fundamentally different sort of technology that's being brought into these societies, and that it's just clobbering the natives once they're being exposed to it. Is that like a fair way of thinking about the role of alcohol, in terms of how people are engaging with the drink in these societies?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so, there's the one that was similar to what you were saying, so that impressed me was David Christian, who's gone on to, I think he does like big history stuff now. But he started out as a Russian alcohol historian, and he had this great line once upon a time in a history of Russian alcohol. He talked about the transition from fermented beverages, your beers, wines, meads, ales, those sort of thing, to sort of these high potency industrial distillates. He kind of made an analogy to sort of the invention of gunpowder, right? And like you say, so you have something of a potency that's well far and above anything that native populations were ever used to, right? And so when you have European colonization and going to other part, going to North America or South Asia or Africa, in some cases there's no history of alcohol consumption. In other cases there's some history of fermentation, very light wines, beers, palm oils, or palm wines, that kind of stuff. But there isn't, this high potent distilled liquors, your whiskeys, your rums, your vodkas, I suppose. And those are industrial revolution developments. Those are industrial distillates, right? Those are part of that particular process. And it really does change like the entire dynamic of colonialism. It's fascinating how much of colonization of the world gets done as much through a bottle as it does through bayonets and bullets, right? So you imagine if you're if you're a white colonial trader and you're going, I don't know, either to North America and you want to trade furs, or if you're going to Africa and you want to trade, palm ice or rubber or something along those lines. You could go into a native community as kind of an outsider. And maybe you have some wares that you can trade, pots and pans, maybe you've got some blankets or whatnot, and you can trade spices or you can trade furs or whatever it is that you need, and you can make a profit on. That's great. But those populations have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years without you, right? You're not necessary to how they've been continuing their lives forever. But and so if you trade with them a pot, they can use that iron pot or iron kettle for the next 20 years. They're not going to need another one. So you're not exactly important to that trade relationship. But if you can introduce this high potent alcohol, and if you can get people addicted to it, and these are people who don't have any history of industrial distillation and don't know how to do it, suddenly, you've got something with constant, perpetual, renewing demand. There's always going to be demand for the thing that you're selling. And you've suddenly got a monopoly on it because nobody else around you can produce it except for the other white colonial traders, right? And so this becomes part of this process of domination and subordination, getting people addicted to this highly potent things, so that they can get more furs, so they can extract more resources, so they can extract more labor and send more people down into the gold mines and the diamond mines in South Africa, or harvesting rubber plants, or even here in the United States, if you look at the American Fur Company, which is what got John Jacob Astor all of his millions and millions of dollars. It was the exact same dynamic, getting Native American populations hooked on alcohol, and then using that and the promise of more alcohol to trade with the one thing that they could have that the white traders wanted, which were minks and furs and all these other elements. And so a very interesting sort of colonial dynamic that we just kind of miss out on because for the most part, our understandings of temperance and prohibitionism has traditionally been couched as kind of white people's politics, right? It only comes into the history books when you start to have white women in the 1840s, 50s, 60s start taking up the mantle with regards to suffragism. And so we miss out on that legacy of colonialism that's just the same in the United States as it is in Africa, South Asia, and many other places.
And then one natural thing that follows up on that notion of creating a demand for your product that only you can satisfy, can we draw any implications from your work for thinking about the opioid epidemic? Obviously, we see a lot of, intense activism within the US, certainly in terms of people trying to deal with the opioid epidemic. There definitely seem to be class-based distinctions or socioeconomic elements to, who tends to be disproportionately affected by it. Although it seems like the strategy seems to be legally based, right? Trying to sort of sue the companies that make these products rather than an outright sort of banning of the products. I don't know. Have you thought about sort of drawing that connection out more explicitly?
Oh yeah. It's but I usually
you do mention it a few times in the book.
Yeah.
I remember. Yeah.
I kind of come from it from the opposite direction, right? So my interest is not so much trying to enlighten present day politics. It's more to get a better understanding of what was happening 100 years ago, right? And so I think 100 years ago it was I guess 2 years ago was the centennial of the 18th Amendment, and I wrote this piece. It was ended up in the New York Times, and focused particularly on that question of how do we understand temperance history. And that was sort of my way of saying, because people like to make a lot of parallels with, the drug war, with regards to prohibitionism, the same sort of, when it comes to cannabis, for instance, or, it comes to pot. But I was like, I don't know, that's probably not quite the right analogy to, sort of the temperance and prohibition movement, but really the opioid epidemic is, right? So if you're, the argument that I was making there is that if you are okay with Purdue Pharmaceuticals going out and getting people addicted to opioids, and then literally sucking them dry, and then leaving them, to be not only addicted, but in many cases end up dead, just for your own profits, well, I guess that's on you if you're okay with that. But if you're not, if you think that there's something kind of morally reprehensible with that, well, congratulations. 100 years ago, you were probably a temperance member, because that was the exact same argument. It wasn't about, again, the morality of the stuff that's in the bottle necessarily, but it was more about, is it okay for one group to profit from the subordination and drunken misery of another population? And so I think that for me was the interesting analog. And if there is, I guess, a sort of a lesson for contemporary politics, it might be what we see after Prohibition, right? Is that you end up having a movement sort of devolving control of the liquor trade to the states, right? And so you get state level alcohol dispensaries. And guess what? We're starting to see these pop up all across the United States. You've got, marijuana dispensaries, right? And the idea is that it's regulated, it's safe, and it generates tax revenue at the same time. So trying to minimize the policy externalities of the trade, but also trying to increase revenues and whatnot. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic.
Okay, now turning to the Q&A from the audience members. One of our guests asks, are there any otherwise unassuming global industries or trades in the present which you feel play a similar part in modern systems of repression, which may not be fully appreciated by people today?
Ooh. That's a good one. I really haven't thought too much about that. Other than, again, opioids, I think this idea of hooking somebody for profit.
Well, you have a lot of typewriters behind you. I'm wondering if you might have a hidden hatred of computers.
No, no, not so much. I got a new one on here. I got
Okay, you're
the
working
Apple
on
here.
a computer. I didn't know if you wanted us all to go back to typewriters.
No, no, I'm no Luddite. Although it is situated on another typewriter, so it's they've kind of taken over it at some to some degree. But in terms of things that are sort of an addictive nature, so I think questions of gambling, right? So if you've got lotteries, gambling, these are other things that people can get addicted on, but it profits the state to some actually a ridiculously large degree. And so having a pushback against those sorts of addictive type things, gambling, cigarettes, anything that I think has that addictive quality that you can make money on. I think there might be a possible analog there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have a couple questions asking about the rollback of prohibition. And the people who've written in about this have written that the prohibition in the United States partly ended to stem the huge rise in crime and power of the mafia that operated and controlled the Black alcohol market. Prohibition was considered a social failure from that perspective. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but that's certainly sort of the conventional wisdom, or at least, what I was taught in public school. Do you see that kind of story in the other societies that did adopt prohibition? Why did temperance movements end in other areas of the world?
Yeah, it's
I know
interesting.
that when
Yeah.
you mentioned the rollback of prohibition, you mentioned a few minutes ago, you mentioned that a lot of the people who spearheaded the drive sort of died or retired, and that there was a rise of neoliberalism as an ideology. You didn't mention sort of the mafia and crime,
Right.
so that was kind of interesting that your perspective didn't align with what the conventional wisdom is.
Yeah, that's and that's another thing. I spend way too much time like on Twitter and whatnot, seeing and just do like keyword searches to see just kind of what the popular understanding is.
Yeah.
And you like the place where it always pops up is one in libertarian circles where prohibitionist is seen as sort of the antichrist in many cases. But also when it comes to sort of pot regulation and everything else that say, well, we obviously should have learned our lesson because prohibition only begets organized crime and whatnot. And I would agree that in many cases that is certainly the case. And I do see, the first book I wrote was Political Power of Bad Ideas, right? The idea that prohibition is a bad idea. It's not a very good policy, and in fact, it got repealed. So, obviously, I'm not out here saying that it was a great idea by any stretch of the imagination. But what's also really weird about it when you start to get into the substance of it is that if you go back to the reasons for prohibition, again, the idea was that it was fighting against, that's why I called it this, smashing the liquor machine, because the liquor machine, it wasn't about, I think the original title was going to be like The War on Alcohol, which is Lisa McGurr's, title essentially. But it wasn't a war on the stuff that's in the bottle. It's about the machine. It's about machine politics. It's about big city, politics where you see in places like Chicago and New York City, where you actually had the prohibition movement was fighting against organized crime, because that was, you had the liquor trade was intimately intertwined with, buying politicians in big city boroughs, right? And so there's entire chapters in here on, the first mob boss, Isaiah Rinders, Captain Rinders in New York City. And so, yeah, the organized crime didn't start with prohibition. It actually started with the liquor trade, 100 years before, or 50 years before prohibition. And the prohibitionist movement was a fight against that. Of course, essentially what they did is took the ostensibly legal alcohol trade and pushed it underground, which isn't a good idea, right? That's just going to make it even worse, which is essentially what happened. But it wasn't as though, everything was just fine and we had this perfectly functioning capitalist trade in alcoholic beverages, before the 18th Amendment. It was a highly corrupt system, and that was part of the argument of the prohibitionists, was that this was part of this kind of progressive movement to cleanse the body politic of all of these these problematic forces that were there to corrupt it, with ill-gotten money and so on. And so they did see sort of the liquor trust of, sort of these big breweries, big distilleries that were influencing, politics. They saw them as kind of the enemy. And so the idea that, we can abolish this would, if you keep the focus on the liquor trade rather than the liquor itself, it's interesting to see how those dynamics played out. Because the one thing, and I know we're kind of running a little short on time, is that there's always been this like historical debate as to whether or not prohibition was successful. Obviously, it gets repealed. That seems like an outright failure. But also, we also look back, in the same sort of distortion that we have between trying to take our modern understandings and project them back into history when it comes to understandings of freedom and liberty. We also have the same thing when it comes to alcohol, right? So we had like the anti-saloon league and all these organizations. Nowadays, saloon sounds like a wonderful kind of old timey Western, Wild West saloon kind of thing. And I talk about this in the conclusion of the book. We have this thing I just call it the Ted Danson effect, right? That we assume that the saloon keeper is this guy like Ted Danson on Cheers, who's going to bend your ear and is going to listen to your problems. And if you've had too much to drink, he's going to pack you in a cab and stuff. No, the saloon keeper was like the pawnbroker. He was, oftentimes a local pimp. He was running the gambling dens. And that's why he was very much influencing local politics, was to, corrupt the system so that they would look the other way. And so the entire system that was in existence before Prohibition was completely different from what we're now used to nowadays. And the one sort of anecdote that got me and kind of blew my mind and made me realize just how far we've come in terms of regulation of the liquor traffic was Carrie Nation. And so, I had the picture up there earlier, the hatchet wielding Carrie Nation, the saloon smasher of Kansas, right? She was out there. She'd go in and smash up these saloons and send the barflies to flights and so on. What time of day was Carrie Nation going in and smashing up saloons and sending all these people, these drunkards to flight? Usually she was doing it between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning. And the people who had been drinking there had been drinking there all night because there was no closing hours. There were no opening hours, and people would just drink there constantly. So there was no regulation of the system. And so now the idea that, that you would have bars that were open at 7 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, seems ridiculous to us. And again, that's, I think, more evidence of sort of this normative change over time that we just kind of miss out on if we just take our contemporary understandings of politics and alcohol and just try to project it back in time, because that's not what history says was actually going on back then.
Okay. And one last final question, since we just have a few minutes left, from one of our guests. Do you feel that there are any lessons from this historical social movement for contemporary global social movements about how to be effective, how to organize, things like that, tactics?
Oh, that's a good one. The parallels that I've seen in many cases, especially being part of doing the international relations discipline and having that focus on like transnational advocacy networks, the Keck and Sick Inc. Kind of notion. One of the things that I think they miss out on is that a lot of it is contemporary focused, right? And you say, if you read Activists Beyond Borders, they kind of assume that it all begins with like the global anti-war movements and women's networks and beginning like the 1960s and so on, and see it as very much a modern phenomenon. But if you go back and recognize like temperance, you see actually kind of a life cycle, right? And it kind of grows, it evolves over time, and like any life cycle, it eventually declines and dies, right? So we don't have really a global temperance movement anymore. We do have some organizations like the International Order of Good Templars kind of morphs into different ways, and now it's interested in things like curbing cigarette addiction and helping developing countries and all sorts of stuff. But for the most part, we don't have it anymore. So it's kind of a dead movement in that way. And I guess there are different ways of thinking about how these movements evolve and die. I mean, they can die in one way, which is that they ultimately achieve their goals, right? So if your focus is on, saving the environment, having, and dealing with climate change, if knock on wood, that we're able to somehow meet the, Paris Climate Accords and development goals, maybe in, 100 years, 150 years, we'll look back on, the international environmental movement as kind of a passing fad, as it were, that was there to confront a particular challenge at that point in time, but is no longer necessary, right? But the other thing, and I guess maybe this would be the lesson for for contemporary transnational advocacy networks or organizations, is not to be content. And so I think what happened to the temperance movement in particular, especially in the United States, after the 18th Amendment was passed, and no amendment had ever been repealed to that point, from the U.S. Constitution, everybody just kind of like, okay, our job here is done, so we did what we were here to do, and all these organizations start to fall apart. The Anti-Saloon League, falls apart effectively in the early 1920s. The Women's Christian Temperance Union does as well. They lose subscribers, they lose adherents, and the whole thing kind of falls apart, right? Without recognizing that, that was only part, I guess, of what would be a sustainable long-term goal. And so I would say, just making sure that you, don't pack things up when you think that victory is assured, because as we've seen, these things can be rolled back over time as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to all of our guests for joining us for this great discussion. As a reminder, recordings, both video and audio recordings, will be available on the Burkle Center website, as well as YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Please feel free to share these recordings with your friends and colleagues. And please be sure to join us for our future book talks at the Burkle Center. Bye, everyone.